Hello and welcome to the webinar on how Plaid Forecast supports strategic enrollment management, planning, and higher education. We're just waiting for a couple more people to join. We'll get going in just a minute. Hello and welcome to the webinar on how Plaid Forecast supports strategic enrollment management, planning, and higher education. My name is Andrew Drinkwater. I'm the co-founder and president of Plaid Analytics. We help universities, colleges, and governments work more effectively with their education data by providing data integration, analytics, enrollment forecasting, which we'll talk about today, and data governance services. Thank you very much for joining us today. On the line with me is my colleague, Pat. Pat,
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pat Lougheed, and I am the other co-founder at Plaid Analytics.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So it has been quite the time period for enrollment planners in Canada over the last couple of weeks. And we're going to disable our cameras from here just so it doesn't block it in the recording. So if you're an enrollment planner in Canada, you've probably seen news pretty similar to this and many other stories that have happened kind of around it. And long story made short is that the federal government has decided to cut back on international study permits by about 35% year over year. This will impact different jurisdictions and different kinds of institutions in different ways. Some provinces are slated to grow because relative to their population, they're underserving international students. Some provinces are slated to decline for the opposite reason. Some may actually maintain a relative status quo over this. But needless to say, it's created a lot of consternation in the sector, lots of challenges, lots of opportunities. Apologies. And this isn't just making news in Canada. This is making news around the world as well. So a couple of representative examples here. I think the open question is whether these kinds of stories are impacting the Destination Canada brand for international students, and whether that may produce a different effect than just the cuts to the caps that the federal government has imposed. Could it mean that fewer students will come at all and that the caps to a certain extent are meaningless? Or will that blow over the series of a couple of weeks? And of course, our favorite higher education analyst in Canada has highlighted this in a number of blog posts as well. So if you're not following Alex Usher, we'd highly encourage it. And of course, you're here, so you've probably heard of Plaid. We're grateful that you've joined us. We've also got a couple of posts on this, and we'll have more in the coming weeks. So enrollment planning has become more important than ever before. As mentioned, in early 2024, a few weeks ago now, the government of Canada cut international study permits by about 30% year over year. With a median tuition rate for international students of about $36,000, this could amount to a significant budget cut relative to plans. We talked in some of our blog posts when comparing different provinces to each other that the impacts of this can be disproportionate in some places versus others. So for example, Alberta is likely to grow, and we'll show some of those examples a little bit later in the webinar, while British Columbia is likely to have to cut back. The two neighboring provinces and the disparate impacts to them are a good reminder that strategic enrollment management is always relevant, not just because SEM creates resiliency in times of emergency, like what British Columbia may experience, but also because it enables an institution to quickly identify and make the most of a growth opportunity, like Alberta is likely to experience. So at Plaid, we empower strategic enrollment management professionals to actively plan and better serve their diverse learners while meeting institutional goals. As mentioned, we provide data integration, analytics, forecasting, and data governance services. We've worked with a number of institutions across North America, some of which are shown here. We're ever grateful for your partnership. Thank you for your support as we help build out this platform. So once upon a time, I worked for a research university, and we had some enrollment forecasting tools, but they weren't incredible technology. We tried rebuilding them using some different technologies, and this helped a little bit with our scalability and our accuracy, but it had an unintended consequence that I became a gatekeeper for enrollment planning. It was too complicated for other users to use, and it was too brittle, which meant that even my teammates struggled to use it. And so as a result, people would email me a spreadsheet of their ideal scenario, I would run it, and then I'd email them back the results. inevitably somebody, either me or another dean, etc., would fall behind on their email and we'd run into these version control challenges. What I really wanted was to make it possible for my associate vice president to ask a question and get results and be able to share them with her colleagues while she was on the bus on the way to campus, back when you did that before the pandemic for your meetings. We couldn't do it at the time, but we can now, and Plaid Forecast has fulfilled this vision. So when we talk about enrollment, there's a few different meanings of that term. I'll also note that there's two different spellings of it. You've probably seen them both in this presentation already. But when we talk about enrollment from a meaning perspective, what we're thinking of for Plaid Forecast here is really about headcount and full-time equivalent over time in an institution. We're talking about an aggregate number of students, and the goal is to support planning. What we're not doing is predicting individual student retention for the purposes of early alerts and interventions. Right now, we project headcount and FTE, which we'll show you here. And we are currently building out projecting course enrollments with some of our partner institutions. So when it comes to being successful with strategic enrollment management planning, particularly around forecasting, we see there's some common challenges. These tend to include areas of responsibility. So often, it can be an Office of Institutional Research and Planning that's responsible for creating an enrollment forecast, but they may or may not prepare the data themselves. That may be IT. But the people that are ultimately accountable for hitting enrollment targets might well be the deans of faculties, or it might be somebody in the central administration, like a provost. And so it can be a little bit murky as to who's responsible for the enrollment forecast. And the honest answer is it really should be everybody who has skin in that particular game who needs to be involved in the process. And so we've built Plaid Forecast to try and create that possibility for people. No longer is it going to be a single analyst like me who is responsible for the enrollment forecast, but that everybody can contribute to ultimately make it better. We also often see challenges around data prep and automation. So a lot of institutions prepare their data manually for the enrollment forecast. Even if it's automated, the process of rolling over from one year to another tends to be a little bit complicated. And the end result of that is that our highly paid analysts, who could be providing deep insights on what the forecast is telling them, they spend their time actually prepping the data, redoing it, reconciling it, and they don't ever get to that analyst insight part where they can provide real value. So we built Plaid Forecast to take care of the data prep for you and simplify it and make it so that in the future, it'll be automated. We often see issues around accuracy and scalability. So if we think of a program offering that has a wide range of programs within it, think of a faculty of medicine, for example. They have large programs, relatively, like family medicine, that has a few hundred residents per year in it. And they have very tiny programs like endocrinology that might have 2 residents per year in it. And so using historical projection methods, such as a moving average or something simple like that, we tend to over-rely on the behavior of a particular individual. If that resident or doctor in training goes on maternity leave, suddenly the program is half the size, and that may impact a forecast. We've chosen to use simulation modeling so that we can get a more accurate projection, even for small programs like that, because we're sampling from a wider distribution and not making a simplistic assumption. When it comes to scalability, we find often that institutions that are using things like spreadsheets for enrollment forecasting run into problems when they get above 100 academic programs and when they try and do interesting things like have multiple scenarios embedded within. Sometimes the spreadsheet methodology just starts to break down once you get to that scale. So we built Plaid Forecast to handle as many programs as you want, and incidentally, to handle them in different ways. So for forecasting purposes, you might choose to combine some programs. Last but not least is around collaboration and version control. So we often see issues where scenarios are emailed back and forth, people fall behind on their email, and in turn, your analysts spend their time reconciling data, but not providing the value-added insight. We wanted to build a platform that would have a single source of truth that everybody could use. They could collaborate with each other and share scenarios with each other right in the platform. So you may have seen in our blog posts that we ended up creating an Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada inspired set of scenarios over the last couple of weeks since the news was announced a little over 2 weeks ago. And it turns out that there isn't really public data in this country on what an institution might look like if we just aggregated all the students up to a federal level. Canada has some work to do in terms of its public data to be useful, but nevertheless, we wanted to try and come up with something to see, like, what could this look like? So how did we do that? We started by estimating the number of current students, and we based this on data from IRCC as of December 31st, 2022. This was the latest that was available for this purpose at the time. We then split those current students based on data from Statistics Canada, their post-secondary student information system from fall 2021, which embarrassingly is the latest available. We'd like to see that improve too. We then estimated the year level that students were at, or progression level, based on the number of approved visas by year. I should note here we're excluding domestic students from these scenarios, which focused only on international students. We then estimated outcomes based on the data available from Statistics Canada. What we found is that retention data was very, very limited. And so we ended up using our own experience to estimate the rest of it. We estimated full-time equivalent students based on experience as well. You can think of a full-time equivalent student as what would be a student if they took the fully required course load for them. At many institutions and many programs, this is 30 credits per year, which works out to 5 courses in the fall and 5 in the winter or spring, and moves around a little bit if you offer a full summer term as well. But a student taking 4 courses per term, for example, would typically be a 0.8 FTE. We then created our fake institution within Plaid Forecast. We called it IRCC, and we substituted college/university, apologies for the typo, for academic programs, and we substituted province/territory for residencies. We then ran some scenarios, which we'll show you shortly. So now we're going to flip and we'll do a live demo of what some of this looks like. Okay, so you're now greeted by the login screen for Plaid Forecast for our IRCC fake institution. I should note here, if it wasn't already obvious, that all the data that you'll see today has been invented. There's no real student data underneath this, only data that resembles what real students may do. So when you log in, and this is integrated with your single sign-on like Microsoft or Google, etc., you'll see a timeline and a summary. So we can see here that there have been a number of scenarios run fairly recently, including today. And then on the right-hand side in the summary, we have what are effectively key performance indicators. So we have 4 scenarios that have been created in this environment. 4 of them have been completed and none are currently running. So let's go into scenarios. What we're going to do first is we're going to take a look at some of the results. So we've got 4 scenarios here. There's a compound growth continued. You can think of this as our scenario A for there were no changes in caps and demand continued unabated and growth continued. We have a 2023 level scenario. This is what would have happened if we flatlined intakes to 2023 levels. We created this scenario back in the summer when we thought maybe the federal government would pull back on the international student visas. But to be honest, we didn't expect they'd pull back as far as they did. So this is here for interest, but it's not a scenario that looks likely now. And then the last 2 that you see here are what we call the allotment undergrad, and compound growth for grad. And that one is effectively what would happen if everyone hit their targets based on the IRCC changes. The last one we see here is a more realistic undergrad and compound growth for grad scenario. And so this kind of pulls back on that a little bit and says, well, some provinces are likely to hit their new targets, but some may not. So for example, we think it's reasonably likely that Alberta will hit its increased target in the not so distant future. So in scenario C here, the allotment undergrad, Alberta shows growth for that. Conversely, the realistic undergrad scenario would assume that Alberta will grow as well. But Quebec has been having some additional issues where the provincial government has said, we're going to cut back on the number of students who come from outside of Quebec in the interest of preserving the French language. So we think it's a little bit less likely that Quebec will hit its growth targets in the near term. That may change over time. And where this impacts international students is that Quebec has a lot of room to grow relative to population for international students. So the big question is, will they be able to do that or not? We've gone with the assumption of maybe not, but maybe they'll be able to. But that's loosely the difference between those last two scenarios, is whether it seems likely that that institution will, or sorry, that province will be able to achieve the new targets or not. So now let's take a look. So as an example, if we compare the first scenario to the third scenario, that will give us a bit of a sense of how things are looking for the country as a whole in an old paradigm where there were lots of growth and a new paradigm where there's a lot less growth and sometimes even cuts. So let's go into this allotment undergrad scenario and see what our results are looking like here. So what we can see is that there was a run of this scenario 18 hours ago, not 18 years ago. And we're just going out to our cloud database to fetch the results in real time. So it'll take a couple seconds to pull that in. And then we can begin to see what we might expect under this kind of a scenario. While that's loading, I'll mention here that scenario runs are not limited to a single run. So in many use cases within higher education, we see institutions that want to update their scenarios on a regular basis. Apologies for that. I just had an error. We'll try that again in a second. Many institutions want to update their scenarios on a regular basis. So for example, we could say update our allotment undergrad and compound growth scenario once a month, or once every 2 weeks, or once a week. By tracking the whole history of the scenario runs, we can then even compare within a scenario how things have changed. And so what might change within a scenario is we keep the intakes constant, but the behavior changes. So maybe more students converted from an applicant to an enrollment, or maybe you retain more students. And we didn't know that a month ago, but we know it now. And so we can update those assumptions as part of a new scenario run. Nothing quite like a live demo. I will come back to that. And in the meantime, I'm going to show you how to create a scenario. So one of the quickest ways to create a scenario is to clone an existing one. So for example, one of the things that's kind of a fun thought experiment in enrollment forecasting is, what would happen if suddenly we ran out of students? Or we stopped admitting students is probably the way to phrase that. And we're going to forecast for 5 years. And so this thought experiment is essentially, if we just turned all our intakes to 0 today, what would happen? Okay, so now we have results. And now we're going to take a look at our parameters. So we just cloned our existing scenario and we renamed it as we stopped admitting students. So let's bring in all of our provinces and territories, and we'll bring in colleges and universities, and we'll bring in each of the next 5 years. So now we have an awful lot of intakes, and these have been estimated as mentioned in the methods before. But what we're going to do here is we're going to just override this and say, we're just going to stop admitting tomorrow. Of course, this is unlikely, but it's an interesting one to do. And then we'll hit run. We're going to do 1,000 iterations of this scenario for statistical reasons. Cole's notes there are the more times that you flip a coin, the more likely you are to get a relatively perfect 50-50 distribution on heads versus tails. The same concept applies here. The more iterations of a scenario we run, the more accurate our results will be. And so now we're running. And if we go back to overview, we can see that it's cloned. And I'll hit refresh a couple of times here. And it appears that my live demo is causing an issue. So apologies for that. I will ask Pat in the background to have a look at that and see if he can get that one to run. So our results are back now. And what we can see from that original allotment, undergrad and compound growth, is that anywhere we look, we're going to see a pretty big decline, but it's not true for every province. So for Ontario, we expect a marked decline in the number of international students in the province because of these federal cutbacks. Ontario, we think, is going to be hit harder than any other province, and colleges, in particular private colleges, may be hit the hardest among that group. Remains to be seen, of course. Now, you may notice this is not the 50% cut that some people are talking about. This is a much smaller cut, and then growth kind of resumes from there. So the reason for that is that Ontario and every other province, as a generalization, have been growing for years. We're talking about total students here, not just new intakes. And so total students will actually kind of continue to grow. But where the growth is going to happen is sort of a combination of, as the previous wave of growth continues and ultimately finishes their studies, that will eventually start to decline, but it might take more than 5 years, particularly for universities. And the growth is going to be in graduate level programs, which are exempt from the cap. Now, conversely, if we hover over this red line, we can see that if Quebec hits their targets, it will grow as well, some of which is grad level, some of which is undergraduate level, because they have room to grow. And if we go down a little bit further, we see growth in Alberta as well. Conversely, if we hover over this yellow line, we can see that British Columbia is also going to have a cut over time. And each of the other provinces is here, but they're all much smaller in terms of the overall proportion. So let's get into some more of the details here. One of the real advantages of using simulation modeling is it actually allows us to have proper medians and 5 and 95% confidence intervals. So if we use full-time equivalent, we then see we have these confidence bands. So the answer to the question of how long is it going to take us to run out of students is actually more than 5 years, even if we stop admitting students today. But we're going to see most of that impact over the next 2 years or so. It'll go down pretty quickly if we stop admitting today, keeping in mind that international students are a smaller base than domestic students. And college programs tend to be shorter, which is what's shown here. If we flip to universities, we see there's still growth almost no matter what. And this comes, depending on the province, either from graduate studies for any province, or from particularly Alberta and Quebec, which are slated to grow according to this scenario. Okay, now, with apologies for my example scenario run, it appears we're now back online. Thank you, Pat, for giving a swift kick to the side of the machine for our demo. So I'm going to hit run again. And now we can see that it's actually running. And so the piece I wanted to highlight here is just how long this took. So we're at about 7 seconds now. If I hit refresh again, it's now done. So in under 20 seconds, we got new results for what's going to happen if we stop admitting our students. And remember, this is all fake data. There's a whole lot of assumptions, but what we can see is that over time, things are going to start to plummet once we start running out of the current crop of students who grew over the last 3 to 4 years. So this gives us the ability to do those kinds of comparisons. Now, if I roll out one more time, I'm going to compare, my original goal for comparison was comparing this allotment plus compound growth scenario, the one that's based on the federal plan. I want to compare it to what might have happened if we continued to have unfettered growth. So I'm going to hit compare, and I'm going to go to other scenarios, and I'm going to say compound growth continued and compare it to the latest run. And so here we see a real divergence, right? The red line is the previous plan of growth could continue. And admittedly, this may be more optimistic than what some institutions were, but this is based on kind of the trend. The blue line is what happens with those cuts. And so we could see that there's going to be a marked drop in the number of students in the college system over those 5 years. In the university system, we do see a drop, but only relative to the original plan. They'll continue to grow in part because of graduate level studies. So this gives you kind of a flavor for the sorts of things that you can do with Plaid Forecast quickly. One of the interesting parts for us in putting together this example was we decided to create a fake institution in order to do it because the public data just wasn't there. And so we did that, and it took us maybe a day to create the institution itself, and then another day of testing different assumptions, particularly around retention, because there wasn't great public data on it. And in the span of about 3 days, we had estimates for what might happen to the country for every province and territory and for both colleges and universities. Will we be right? Probably not. But having multiple scenarios to be able to test out different possible futures and figure out what the impact of those could be for institutions allows us to better plan for the future and to adjust our activities to be able to support the kinds of growth that we want to support and to be able to make sure that we're within new regulations and rules that have come in from the government. Having this data is better than not having anything, which is what we've seen a lot in the news, where people just make assumptions and say, well, they've cut by this much, so therefore the sector is going to crash and burn, or things like that. We would argue that having data as part of the conversation makes it a more informed conversation so the institutions can create real strategy. I will now flip back to the PowerPoint and we'll wrap up the webinar because I realize we have only a few minutes left. So in closing, Plaid Forecast is a mobile-friendly enrollment forecasting platform that'll save you time, increase your accuracy, engage your stakeholders in the strategic enrollment management planning process. We would love to partner with you if you're trying to figure out how to plan your way through this particular juncture in time, and your tools maybe aren't working quite as quickly or as accurately as you would like. And so to that end, feel free to reach out to us. We can talk about what a demo might look like. We can talk about a trial, many of those other kinds of things. And most importantly, we can work with you on a strategy for how you can successfully forecast what may happen to your institution and update it on an ongoing basis, as we suspect lots of things will change between now and September. So with that, I will pass on my sincere thanks for everybody who attended our webinar today. And would certainly welcome questions at any time. You can contact us, I believe in the Q&A on the webinar, or through email at info@plaid.is. We're happy to answer questions. We're also really curious if doing brainstorming with institutions would be something that was of interest. They can walk through some of these processes. If you're on our mailing list, you'll get a notice about that tomorrow. And yeah, we'd just love to partner with you and help you navigate through what may well be a crisis for some institutions and may be a great opportunity for others. We can lend a hand and help you move quicker. So thanks very much to everybody for taking the time today. We'll stick around for a few minutes for questions, but this concludes our webinar. Hope you all have a great day. And of course, happy planning. Good luck coming up with different scenarios and determining what they mean. It's an interesting time to be an enrollment planner, but the exciting part is that you can delve deeper into the data, learn more about what may happen, and provide real insight to your institutions. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.